As Sandy mentioned, it's so good to see you all here. And again, we do welcome, especially welcome those of you who are visiting with us. If you recall, this past Tuesday was a beautiful day. The weather was so nice, I decided to put on some shorts and do some yard work. Holy Week is not the ideal time for a minister to do yard work. It's a busy time of the year for clergy. But I needed to do the work in order to beat the snakes. You see, I live by the Casey Canal, which breeds copperheads. And they love our backyard. Since we moved into the house 17 years ago, I have killed 6 of them in our yard. Actually, 5 of them. One of them actually got inside our house. So I have learned that it's very, very important to keep our backyard as bare as possible. To pull all the weeds and not let the grass get too high. Long grass and weeds draw snakes. It's a great place for them to hide and reside. Things don't grow in our backyard during the winter. There's lots of shade. But now that the weather is warmer, the weeds and the grass have started to grow. So even though this was not a good week to do yard work, I needed to do it before any snakes got the idea of heading our way. Because they not only endanger Sherry and me, they endanger our dogs. We have 5 of them. Not on purpose. It was an accident that we turned into a dog pound. But since we have 5 dogs, there are other things I need to be careful of in our yard besides snakes. 5 dogs can create quite a minefield, if you get my drift. But Tuesday, I pleasantly worked in the yard for 2 hours without running into any of their creations. I couldn't believe it. I started wondering what they were doing. Were they going off campus or something? And then I moved to a different direction of the yard, and eureka! My nose suddenly told me I had discovered their spot. In fact, the strong aroma told me I was surrounded by it. And so I stopped in my tracks to look around. When I looked down, I noticed that there was a great big pile right between my legs. I bet you didn't expect a sermon like this on Easter Sunday. So there is this great big pile between my legs. I don't know how I missed stepping into it. I have very short legs. There's not much distance between one foot and the other, but somehow the pile sat right between them. And so I looked down and started to move my right foot to avoid the pile, when all of a sudden I noticed that the pile has a beautiful pattern on it. It kind of looked like artwork. And I thought to myself, my goodness, I've got some very talented dogs. I mean, it was the prettiest pile of poo I'd ever seen. And then it dawned on me that the pile with the pretty hourglass markings on it didn't have anything to do with my dogs. It was a great, big, coiled up copperhead. Have you ever straddled a copperhead snake before? In short pants? I had both of my pale white legs on either side of it. It was as if I was asking it to bite me. Which side would you like? I obviously did not move. And I started trying to remember where I put my car keys so I could drive myself to the hospital. Figuring I had nothing to lose, I started talking to the snake. I said, "I love you." I said, "I am a minister," and actually 3 weeks ago, I preached a sermon called Snake Theology. I did. And I took up for you snakes. I told people you had gotten a bad rap, that actually you had been a symbol for health and healing, and I would love it if you would live up to my remarks. Now here was one problem. There was a big, tall chunk of grass that was preventing me from seeing its head, which was a bit discomforting. Because I couldn't tell if he was listening to me or if he was about to bite my ankle. But he must have liked what I said, because he allowed me to skip away from him. Unfortunately for him, I skipped back with my shovel. So he couldn't harm my dogs. But I do so appreciate him not sinking his fangs into me. You know, that's the scaredest I've been in a very long time. My heart was pumping for a while after that. And I can't tell you how good it is to be here with you on this Easter Sunday. Something like that kind of helps put everything into perspective. We are gathered here today because of something that happened many years ago in a cemetery. And the thing that happened scared the tar out of people. One Sunday morning, 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and a woman named Salome, bought spices and went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus. There's this very human element in the story that I love about this scene. They have gone to the trouble of getting the spices, but while taking the journey to the tomb, they realize that they don't have a key. There's a huge stone in front of the tomb. It's too heavy for them to move. They can't get in. That's something I would do, perhaps something you would do, many of us would do. Go to the trouble of planning to do something, but then forgetting a basic thing that prevents you from doing it. They left the house without a key. Their forgetfulness is understandable. They hadn't had much sleep that weekend. They must have been exhausted. But as you know, when they arrive, they discover that the big stone has been moved. Not only that, the body is gone. They receive a divine message that Jesus had been raised from the dead and that they are to go back and tell the disciples. The text says the women run out of the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's how the Gospel of Mark ends. Now, if you get a hold of a Bible and turn to the 16th chapter of Mark, you will see that the story goes on a little bit longer, and it tells about Jesus appearing to some of his disciples. That part was added many years later, written by a different author. What you heard today from Dottie was the original ending of the story. And it must have made some early church fathers nervous that there was nothing in Mark's gospel about the disciples seeing Jesus after his death. That's kind of not good for business. That's not the way to run a resurrection. So they added some material. But the original ending was what you heard today. Now, it's not that the writer couldn't have added stories about Jesus appearing to people. He knew about them. The stories were well known. And the Apostle Paul's writings were available. It's not that the writer didn't know about the appearances. For some reason, it was important for the writer to end the story with the women running from the tomb, silent and afraid. I don't know why. Nobody knows why. Scholars have theories, but nobody's sure why the writer ended it this way. Perhaps the author had a flair for the dramatic and wanted to give it a suspenseful ending. You know, these stories were told orally at first before they were written down. And so if you were telling this story, this would have been a very dramatic way to end it. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Blackout. Actor Alec McGowan thought it was such a good ending. Such a good ending that in 1978 he memorized the entire Gospel of Mark, developed a one-man show, went to New York City, and recited the whole Gospel to audiences on Broadway. The Gospel of Mark was a Broadway show. It's got a good ending for theater. The great late homiletics professor Fred Craddock, who died last month, always had interesting things to say about biblical text. He suggested that the writer stop the story where he did because he didn't want to get his listeners too far away from the cross. That is, he wanted them to remember that the one we celebrate and seek to follow was crucified, and that he told his followers that they needed to take up their cross too. If this is why the writer stopped where he did, you can understand why so much of Christianity has focused way too much on the resurrection and the afterlife, playing games of who's going to heaven, instead of doing the real work of the Christian faith, the real work of Christ on earth. And so perhaps the writer stopped where he did to remind us of what the way of Christ is really all about, and that it is not easy. If the dream of the kingdom of God on earth is not dead, but alive, then there is work to be done, risk to be taken, dangers to be faced. No wonder the women ran. Sometimes good news isn't such good news. He's alive? You mean if we follow him, we really have to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us? No wonder they were afraid. Perhaps the writer ends the story the way he does because it's really not supposed to be an ending. I saw a movie the other day, and the prologue was 20 minutes long. We found out how the main character was born, what his family was like, where he went to school, who he dated. They did a whole lot to set the stage. We were well into it for 20 minutes, and then the title of the movie appears along with some dramatic music in the background, and then the movie really began. Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, only 16 short chapters, 16 energetic chapters. Remember his favorite word all throughout the Gospel is immediately. Immediately Jesus did this. Immediately the disciples did that. 16 short chapters of action that tell us about this leader, this rabbi, this teacher, this Son of God, how he lived, how he died. Maybe that's the prologue. The rest of the story is about you and me, and we're to write it. We know the rest of the three women's story. We know what they did. Yes, they were scared to death after they saw the empty tomb. Yes, they were silent and said nothing to no one because they were afraid. But things changed. They changed. They eventually started sharing the good news, and the rest is history. Do you know that in any of the four Gospels, the risen Christ never made an appearance in public? The only ones who saw him in the Gospels were his followers. No public appearances. Craddock says, if I had been running it, I would have had Jesus go around town, go back to Pilate's hall and say, hey, Pontius, you want to give it another shot? That's the way I would have done it, said Craddock. And for people who doubted, agnostics and atheists, I'd have had Jesus appear and just scare them to death. And then Craddock says, but that just shows you how small I am, how big God is. If you read the New Testament, the Gospels, nobody saw him except his followers. We cannot expect the public, the culture, society in general to sustain the real meaning of Easter. It is a Christian word, a Christian concept, a Christian commitment, a Christian message. Jesus Christ is risen. If the message of Easter is lost and dwindles down and eventually peters out, Easter will become nothing more than colored eggs and rabbits, breaks from school, lunch with the family, trips to the beach, a spring break. If it becomes only that, it's not the fault of the culture. It's not the fault of the government or the fault of schools, because it is the church's message. It is the message of the followers of Jesus Christ. And so let's look at the ending of the Gospel of Mark, not as the end of a story, but as the beginning of one. The beginning of our story, of whether or not we will share the good news. Sharing with others that God is a God who gives life to the dead. Letting them know it's been that way ever since creation. God brought it into being, brought into being what didn't exist. And out of chaos formed the world. That's the way God is. God gives life to the dead. Abraham and Sarah, so old they couldn't have kids. They were over 100. And even though they were dead as far as procreation was concerned, they had a child and named him Laughter, Isaac. There was Paul, dead to his anger and bitterness, dead to his pride and self-righteousness and ego. But out of all of that deadness, God brought new life, life that changed the world. I see people sitting in this sanctuary today, many people who are here today because someone had the courage and the compassion to tell them that God is a God of love, a God who brings life out of death. A number of you have told me, I can't believe I'm here. I never went to church. Or I haven't been to church in many, many years. Or I always thought church was just a bunch of talk and hypocrisy. I never realized just what it could mean to me. Let us remember that there are many people outside of here who need to hear the good news, who need to hear that God is a God of love. A God who brings life out of death, life out of struggle. And let us keep in mind that all of us here at this church, all of us, will go through times of hardships and difficulties, times when we feel distant from God. And that we will need to be there for each other, to remind one another that God loves you and that God will help you bring life out of your death. I believe the best way to share this message of life and resurrection is not in public arenas such as this. I believe the best way to do it is the way the risen Christ did it in the Gospels. One-on-one, in small groups, over the breaking of bread. When you can really get to know someone and let them get to know you, so you can truly express care and concern for one another. There are times we all need to share the good news, and there are times we all need to hear the good news. For you see, no matter how hard I try, I'll never be able to keep all the snakes out of my backyard. Because after every winter, there is spring. After the grass dies, it grows. After it turns brown, it turns green. It reminds us of how God works. It's just what God does. God can't help it. It's in God's DNA. So snakes or no snakes, there is nothing to fear. Nothing. For God is a God of love, a God who brings life out of death. Let us no longer be silent or afraid. Let us share the good news, as the women eventually did. He is risen. He is risen indeed.